She just wanted some peace and quiet. But she had to share her room with the most arrogant man at the conference. What began with animosity ended up changing both their lives forever. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, please leave a comment indicating where you're watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Snow fell in soft flakes over the triangular roofs of the most exclusive resort in the Colorado Rockies. Amber lights reflected in the stained glass windows of the lobby, as if time there were made of frozen elegance. Isabel "Izzy" Rossi, wrapped in a gray overcoat, clutched her bag strapped tightly as she crossed the white marble hall. Her firm brown eyes ignored the surrounding luxury. All she saw was the chance to change her future at this international investment conference. After years fighting to prove her worth in a market dominated by dynasties and influential surnames, this event represented more than an opportunity. It was her final test. Arriving at the reception, reservation confirmation in hand and her English impeccable, she hoped for a quiet stay before presenting her project. But the hesitant expression of the hotel clerk sent a chill down her spine. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Rossi. There's been a system error. The only room currently available is a double room, shared." The sentence hit her like a punch to the gut. Izzy's eyes widened. "Shared?" she repeated softly, as if doubting her own sanity. "Are you telling me that in this 6-star resort there isn't another room available? Not even a presidential suite? Nothing?" The receptionist, blushing, shook her head. "All rooms were reallocated due to yesterday's blizzard. The helicopters couldn't land. There was an unexpected overbooking. We can offer a partial refund or force me to share a room with a stranger." Izzy's irritation was palpable, and the receptionist looked away. Before she could insist, a male voice, calm, deep, and with a tone bordering on irony, sounded beside her. "It seems we're stuck together, aren't we?" Turning, she found herself facing a tall man in a black overcoat, his light eyes colder than the landscape outside. It was Alexander Sterling, the CEO of Europe's largest fintech company. She knew that face from cover stories and icy interviews. Just her luck. She barely managed to hide her disappointment. Perfect. Just when everything needed to go according to plan. Alexander arched an eyebrow as if amused by the situation. "Believe me, sharing my space with anyone isn't in my plans either, but if it's any consolation, I usually sleep early and snore very little." Izzy huffed, turning back to the receptionist. "How long will this absurd situation last?" "3 nights, the woman replied regretfully. Alexander stepped forward and handed over his black credit card with practiced ease. "Let's simplify this. Put both names on the reservation. If Ms. Rossi wishes, I can arrange for separate dinners. Alternate times for using the room. Civility isn't lacking on my part." His voice was too calm, as if he were above human discomfort, but Izzy felt her blood boil. "I don't need your kindness, Mr. Sterling. I just want to follow my schedule and leave here with what I came for." "And what would that be?" he asked, already walking beside her towards the elevator. "To conquer what's mine, even if the world insists it doesn't belong to me." The room was as luxurious as the rest of the hotel. 2 beds separated by a glass partition with built-in lighting, a balcony overlooking the mountains, an automated fireplace, a bathroom with Italian marble. But none of it mattered to Izzy, who tossed her suitcase onto the bed with a frustrated sigh. Alexander, on the other side, was already removing his coat with economical movements, like someone accustomed to dominating any territory. "Don't worry, I won't disturb your quest for glory. I can be an excellent invisible guest." Izzy crossed her arms and faced him. "Stay out of my way. I'm only here to show that merit still exists, even if you top-tier men try to erase it." Alexander smiled without showing his teeth. "You're interesting. Few challenge me with such fire in their eyes." Izzy remained firm, but inside, a part of her felt the tension of being too close to someone who represented everything she had learned to fight against. The first night was made of cutting silence. Izzy spent hours in front of the large picture window, watching the snow-covered Rockies as the wind whispered against the glass, as if the mountains themselves were judging her choices. Across the room, Alexander read reports on a tablet with almost military attention. The sound of digital pages turning was the only noise besides the crackling fireplace. They avoided each other like soldiers in opposing trenches. When Izzy crossed the room to get a bottle of water, Alexander didn't even look up. Still, he seemed aware of her every move. "Are you prepared for tomorrow's presentation?" he asked without taking his eyes off the screen. "I don't usually leave anything to chance," she replied curtly. "Good to know, though I doubt the committee is open to speeches laden with resentment." Izzy stopped mid-stride. Funny. Coming from someone born at the top, it's easy to confuse grit with resentment. Alexander, for the first time, looked at her. There was something in his eyes, not arrogance, but a skeptical curiosity. "You want to hate me? And I understand, but life isn't always fair, and that's not my fault," she replied without blinking. "But it's convenient for you that it stays that way." The next morning, the conference hall was filled with refined voices, expensive perfumes, and rehearsed speeches. Izzy walked through the corridors with calculated steps, aware that her every move would be judged, not just her proposal, but her simple attire, her slight accent, her presence disconnected from the financial aristocracy gathered there. Alexander, meanwhile, was already on stage, being interviewed by a Bloomberg TV anchor about billion-dollar mergers in the data intelligence sector. "We need to be bold. The future belongs to those who take risks," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, drawing enchanted gazes. Izzy sat in the front row. Her expression was neutral, but inside, she seethed. She couldn't stand that rhetoric of power presented as virtue. When the Q&A session opened, she stood up. The microphone picked up every syllable. "Expanding without measuring risks can sink even the oldest empires," she said. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Alexander looked at her, surprised but not disarmed. "Risks are part of it, but you're right on some points." His tone was calm, almost admiring. "Perhaps we have something to learn from each other." For the first time, their eyes met without hatred, only tension and a newly discovered respect. Later, at the resort's cafe, Izzy was surprised to see him. Approach with 2 steaming cups in his hands. He sat down opposite her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're right about the impact analysis. My team overlooked important data in the last few quarters." Izzy looked at him suspiciously. "And why are you telling me this?" Alexander shrugged. "Perhaps because few people here speak the truth. And because you made me think." She arched an eyebrow. "I don't need your validation." "I know," he replied with a half-smile. "But I wanted you to know anyway." The silence between them changed texture. It was no longer made of resistance, but of assessment. Izzy picked up her cup, hesitant. "You still represent everything that irritates me." Alexander chuckled softly. "And you're the first person in a long time who's jolted me out of autopilot." And in that instant, between the steam from the coffee and the cold pressing against the windows, something began to unravel. It wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of a dangerous rapprochement. That night, in the silent room, Izzy lay with her gaze fixed on the ceiling. The conference had ended, and she felt a mixture of victory and disorientation. Alexander had been cordial throughout dinner, and his attention didn't seem performative. From the other side of the glass partition, he approached, a book in his hands. "Are you reading about microcredit?" she asked, noticing the cover. "I was curious about your project. I looked into it." She sat up in bed, surprised. "And what did you think?" "I thought it was brilliant, focused, and with real impact. You think beyond spreadsheets." Izzy laughed ironically. "Isn't that a criticism coming from a CEO?" "It's a compliment, rare but sincere." Silence returned, but it was comfortable this time. Then Alexander drew closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "If I kiss you now, "Will you hate me, Yolgul, afterward?" She didn't answer. She just let the kiss happen. It was a restrained touch, yet laden with everything they hadn't said. And when their lips parted, the world seemed quieter. Izzy whispered, almost surprised by her own words, "You're not as unbearable as I thought." Alexander smiled. "The room that separated us has now brought us together." The next morning, the chill wasn't just outside, it was palpable between Izzy and her conference colleagues. The video of her verbal sparring with Alexander had gone viral within the financial industry's inner circles. Some called her audacious, others arrogant. But she knew what she had done, shown that the game doesn't only belong to those born with a winning hand. As she reviewed charts on her phone during the closing brunch, she heard poorly disguised whispers. "That's her, the Latina who confronted Sterling. They say she used to be a waitress in Chicago." Izzy lifted her chin, pretending not to hear. Alexander watched her from across the room. There was something new in his gaze. Not superiority, but a kind of quiet pride. He approached, ignoring the stares. "You've achieved something few manage here, genuine attention. They're talking about you because they feel threatened." She replied firmly, "I'm not here to provoke. I'm here to earn it." Alexander nodded. "And you deserve it. That's clearer to me now than ever before." That night, Izzy received a short text message. "Dinner with me? No audience, no tension. Just two humans trying to understand each other." For some reason she couldn't quite explain. She accepted. They met in one of the hotel's smaller lounges where the fireplace cast warm shadows on light wood-paneled walls. During dinner, their defenses lowered. Alexander spoke of his lonely childhood, marked by the pressure of a stern father and the absence of any demonstration of affection. "I grew up understanding that love was weakness, that success was the only way to be seen." Izzy listened in silence, touched by a pain he hid well. In return, she told him about the nights she studied by the light of the bakery where she worked, about her mother who had raised 3 children alone, about the fear of failing even after so much effort. "If I fall now, it's not just my name that hits the ground. It's the names of everyone who believed in me when I had nothing." Alexander reached his hand across the table. "You're not alone, nor do you need to prove anything more to anyone." And in that gesture, more intimate than a kiss, she saw the first real crack in his armor. Hours later, back in the room, the silence between them was different. There was no more tension, there was anticipation. Alexander removed his jacket and loosened his tie slowly, as if each movement required her permission. Izzy, standing on the balcony, watched the snow fall. When she turned, he was closer. "We can pretend that tomorrow everything goes back to normal if you want. But tonight, I just want to be here." She approached slowly. "We spent so much time resisting that now it just feels strange to allow it." Alexander gently enfolded her, his fingers tracing the contour of her face. "You made me rethink many decisions." The kiss came as an answer, slow, deep, unhurried. And that night, beneath the warm covers and the soft weight of shared silence, there was no past or future, only 2 bodies that had been adversaries and now discovered the relief of being a refuge for each other. The night wasn't perfect, it was real, and that, for both of them, was rarer than any luxury. But dawn didn't just bring light through the sheer curtains. It brought the return of the real world. Izzy woke first, still wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets, her head resting on Alexander's chest. For a moment, she thought of leaving everything as it was, of pretending that this bubble could last longer than a few hours. But her phone, vibrating with social media notifications, burned like a cruel reminder. Nothing was secret. As she got up and unlocked the device, she saw the photos. Someone from the hotel had snapped pictures of them entering the private lounge together, and now the financial gossip sites were speculating about an explosive romance between CEO and rookie consultant. The blood drained from her face. When Alexander woke, she was already dressed, her suitcase packed. "Izzy?" he murmured, confused. She didn't even look at him. "This was a mistake. We need to go our separate ways." He got up, approaching her. "Do you really believe this was a mistake?" Her eyes welled up, but her voice was firm. "We can't control what people think, but I can control what I give them as ammunition." And she left, taking only the clothes on her back and a divided heart. The following days were a blur for Izzy. Back in Chicago, she threw herself into work as if she could bury her feelings under piles of spreadsheets and cold meetings. Social media, however, didn't allow Alexander's memory to fade so easily. Every time she opened her phone, she was faced with venomous headlines. Ambitious consultant or calculated affair. 1. Read. CEO involved with newcomer raises suspicions of favoritism. There was no defense, no context, just the scorn of a world that fed on easy narratives and judged women more harshly than any risk assessment. Alexander tried to call. He sent messages, emails. "I want to talk. Tell me where you are." Izzy ignored them. Part of her wanted to hear that voice again. The other, more wounded part, preferred to forget he existed. In the end, it was easier to suffocate the pain with silence than to face what it all really meant. 3 weeks later, at the end of a rainy Friday, Izzy threw up for the 3rd time before lunch. She thought it was stress or a cold. But on Saturday morning, standing in front of the pharmacy's test aisle, something inside her knew. She didn't need confirmation. Her body was already screaming the truth. Back in the small apartment she rented in Pilsen, she went into the bathroom and locked the door, as if the world could be left outside. She sat on the cold floor, holding the test like a time bomb. The silence was deafening. When the 2 red lines appeared, a tear slowly ran down her face. "This can't be happening. I was careful," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself she had control over the uncontrollable. In that moment, between white tiles and the faint light from the fogged mirror, everything changed. She was no longer just Izzy Rossi, the woman fighting for professional respect. She was Izzy, a mother. She spent the following days in a state of practical denial. She kept going to work, answering emails, attending meetings, as if her life hadn't just been turned upside down. But at night, when she lay down, she felt the weight of a future growing inside her and the responsibility to protect it, no matter the cost. She thought about telling Alexander. She wrote a long message with details, doubts, a request to talk, but she never hit send. "He'll think I'm using this against him, or he'll feel obligated to be part of it," she'd tell herself softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. She couldn't bear the idea of being seen as opportunistic, as a woman trapping a man with a child. That hurt her more than any website headline. And so, she made the hardest decision of her life. She would leave Alexander out of the equation. She would raise this child alone. "I can handle this," she repeated like a mantra. "I'll raise this baby with or without him." In the following months, she moved to New York. An opportunity as an associate consultant at a social impact firm opened the door for a fresh start. The city was intense, tough, but ironically accommodating to her internal contradiction. A woman who had fallen for an inaccessible man and now walked the cold streets with a life growing inside her. Her belly began to show discreetly in the 5th month. Izzy avoided mirrors. She still felt torn between strength and fragility. There were days when she faced multi-million-dollar contracts with firmness, and, at night, who cried listening to a lullaby by chance. She bought a second-hand crib, assembled the nursery with her own hands, hung paper stars from the ceiling. "Everything will be all right," she'd say, stroking her belly. "Mommy's here." But deep down, no matter how much she tried to convince herself, she knew something or someone was still missing. The event was one of the most anticipated of the year, the Global Economic Innovation Summit held in Boston. Izzy didn't want to go, but her presence was expected. She now represented one of the most promising consultancies in the microcredit and social impact sector, and her schedule included 2 panels and a meeting with Canadian investors. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly quite visible, but she maintained her sober elegance, a navy blue midi dress, hair in a bun, and an unshakable posture. She was walking through the convention center corridors, a folder of documents in hand, when she saw him, Alexander. He was in front of the main auditorium, surrounded by aides, as always. Time had made him even more imposing, the same firm gaze, the same discreet elegance. But there was something in his face, perhaps the weariness of those who carry an unidentified void. When his eyes met hers, she froze, and then his eyes drifted down to her belly. They stopped there, and the world stopped with them. She tried to turn, to walk away, to disappear, but Alexander didn't move. He just crossed the hall with long strides, ignoring everything. Around him, Izzy. His voice was low but firm. She turned slowly, as if her body wasn't obeying her mind. "Hi, Alexander." He looked at her belly again, then at her eyes. "You're pregnant. How long did you plan on hiding this?" There was disbelief in his voice, and pain. Izzy felt the words catch in her throat. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" He laughed humorlessly. "Because what I think is that you left, vanished from the map, blocked me on everything, and now you show up here, heavily, pregnant." She looked down. "I just thought it was better this way." "Better for whom, Izzy?" "Because for me, it feels like I was erased from the equation." The silence between them was like a shattered mirror. Finally, she replied, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to feel obligated. I didn't want you to think That you what?" he interrupted. "That you wanted to trap me. Do you think this changes what happened between us?" The discussion continued in a secluded corner of the convention center, away from cameras and whispers. Izzy was visibly shaken. She sat in one of the leather armchairs, her hands on her belly. "I was scared you'd think I used this against you, scared of becoming a headline, of being judged again." Alexander knelt before her. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the CEO. He was just a man trying to understand. "This baby is mine too. You don't get to decide this alone." She looked at him, tears in her eyes. "But I was the one who was alone. I was the one who threw up for weeks, not knowing what to do. I was the one who assembled the crib at 2 in the morning with an aching back and fear of tomorrow." His voice trembled. "And if you had told me, if you had given me a chance, I would have been there. I would have done everything with you." Izzy shook her head, overcome with exhaustion. "You were the man sleeping beside me, and I feared I didn't truly know you. I didn't know what I could trust." Alexander lowered his head. "Then give me that chance now. Let me be present." In the following days, Alexander made his presence felt, not with promises, but with actions. He showed up at the clinic where Izzy had her prenatal appointments with a decaf coffee and a printed ultrasound. He brought flowers, simple, discreet sunflowers, as she had once mentioned offhandedly. He attended appointments in silence, holding her hand when she trembled, asking questions that showed he wanted to understand, not control. On the 3rd visit, he appeared with a design for a sustainable crib by architects specializing in infant ergonomics. "You're overdoing it with this nursery," Izzy said, trying to hide a smile. "Overdoing it for you two is the best thing I've ever done," he replied, a sincere glint in his eyes. Slowly, the barrier between them began to crumble. There was no immediate forgiveness, but there was space for rebuilding. And in that space, they relearned to trust. One gesture, one conversation, one welcomed silence. At a time. In the following weeks, Alexander's presence became so constant that his absence started to feel like a system error. He began attending first-time parent classes with Izzy, and was the only man among dozens of women who watched in silent, astonished awe as he took notes with almost obsessive seriousness. At the end of the breastfeeding class, he asked the instructor if there was anything fathers could do to not interfere with the mother-baby bond. Izzy laughed. You're the only CEO I know who worries about not interfering. He shrugged with a shy smile. I never thought about being a father, but now it's all I think about. Her apartment, once solitary, began to feel like a home. A new dresser, an anti-allergy rug, small objects that appeared without warning but with meaning. One night, she found him sitting on the nursery floor, testing a Star Mobile. Is it crooked? He asked. It's perfect, she replied, leaning against the doorframe, her eyes misty. That was it. The unlikely perfection of someone who chooses to stay, even when they could leave. On a particularly cold night, Alexander showed up with a bottle of warm milk with vanilla, saying it helped with sleep. They sat on the sofa, both wrapped in a thick blanket. Izzy felt her feet swollen, her body tired, and her mind exhausted. You don't have to be here every night, you know, she said, trying to protect herself from that feeling of dependence. Alexander looked at her sweetly. I know, but I want to. Be. She looked away. It's hard to trust. You. Everything. He nodded, understanding. I didn't come to convince you of anything. I came to rebuild what we let crumble, even if it takes time, even if it hurts. And she cried, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time in a long time, there was someone there who didn't want to win, prove, or dominate. Someone who simply wanted to be. And that constancy was, perhaps, the rarest form of love. With time, they began to share more than medical appointments. They shared laughs in supermarkets, fears during nights of false contractions, dreams whispered before sleep. Alexander, previously meticulous, now allowed himself to improvise. He burned toast, got the shopping lists wrong, mixed up the names of vitamins. Izzy, who always had to be strong, now found herself saying, "Help me," without it sounding like weakness. One afternoon, returning from the doctor's office, he placed a hand on her belly and said, I think she's going to have your nose. Izzy looked at him surprised. She, Alexander smiled, just a hunch. The following week, the ultrasound revealed 2 heartbeats, twins, a boy and a girl. Alexander was silent for a few seconds, stunned. 2? He repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Izzy, holding his hand, just whispered, 2. And in that moment, they both laughed until tears came, because there was something miraculous in that mess, something neither of them could ever have planned. In the 34th week of gestation, on a night when the winds seemed to blow harder than usual, Izzy felt a sharp pang low in her abdomen. She was home alone while Alexander was in an emergency video conference. She tried to ignore it, breathed deeply, counted the minutes between pains. When she realized they were coming every 7 minutes, she called him. The call went to voicemail. She didn't insist. She grabbed her hospital bag, called a cab, and went to the hospital. Upon arrival, the doctor confirmed premature labor. A few hours later, Alexander rushed in, his face white with worry. Are you okay? Why didn't you wait for me? She replied with a weak smile. Because our children didn't want to wait. He held her hand throughout the entire process. He cried when he saw the little ones born, first Daniel, then Olivia. And amidst the cries and the machines monitoring vital signs, Alexander looked at Izzy with tear-filled eyes. I've never felt anything like this. You've transformed me. And she, exhausted but whole, replied in a hoarse voice, I wasted time running from you. The morning after the twins' birth, the hospital room felt like a capsule from another reality. The soft sunlight filtered through the blinds, bathing the sheets, the incubators, and Izzy's sleeping face in gold. Alexander sat in an armchair beside her, holding Daniel in his arms while a nurse adjusted the wires monitoring Olivia. He didn't know how to describe it. It was as if the world had gained new contours. Everything before had seemed urgent, but now there was only one time, the present. He looked at the 2 little ones, their features still fragile, their eyes closed as if still dreaming of the womb. And suddenly, he knew. There, with trembling hands, he picked up his phone and made a few calls. 2 hours later, the hospital was discreetly filled with flowers, electric candles, lavender arrangements, and a small, silent film crew. He transformed that room into an altar. Izzy woke to the sound of a violin playing softly at the door. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but when she opened her eyes, she saw the flowers, the amber lights, and Alexander standing, holding a small navy blue velvet box. He wasn't wearing the disposable gown. He wore a light grey suit, probably rushed from the hotel where he was staying. "What is this?" she murmured, still sleepy. "Madness. An immense, beautiful madness," he replied. He walked to the bed, knelt carefully, his eyes misty, and spoke with a choked voice. "Izzy, I never believed in these things. I never imagined that a mistake at a hotel reception would put me in front of the love of my life. But today, holding our children, I understood. You saved me from myself. Marry me, not because of the children, not because of what we've built, but because I love you, and because I never want to wake up without seeing you smile." Izzy covered her mouth with her hands, tears falling freely. "You're crazy," she whispered. "I am. But I'm yours, if you'll have me." The room filled with timid applause, nurses, doctors, and a discreet photographer capturing everything delicately. Izzy nodded, crying, "Yes, of course, yes." Alexander carefully placed the ring on her finger, as if touching something sacred. Then he kissed her, right there, with the raw emotion of those who have fought battles and survived. The twins slept, oblivious to the historic moment their parents were experiencing. The camera recorded every detail, but the scene was so genuine that nothing seemed staged. When the music ceased and silence settled again, Alexander sat beside Izzy on the bed and rested his head on her shoulder. "You know, I think now I can say it was all worth it. Every mistake, every separation, every tear." She stroked his hair, murmuring, "Who would have thought it all started with an overbooked room?" And he replied with a smile, "The best mistake of my life." In the following weeks, even with the exhausting routine of newborns, Izzy and Alexander began planning the wedding. She suggested something simple, intimate, but he insisted, "I want the world to know you're my choice. Not a secret, not a scandal, a love proclaimed out loud." And so they set the ceremony for the following summer. They decided it would be at the same resort in the Rockies where it all began, as a way to re-signify the past, to transform chance into destiny. Izzy hesitated at first. "I don't want to remember the pain," she said, looking at old photos of the place. Alexander tenderly replied, "We won't remember the pain. We'll rewrite the place with a different story." And she understood. The past wouldn't be erased, it would be healed, and this time by the hands of love itself. Olivia had always been the more delicate of the two. While Daniel nursed voraciously and cried with full lungs, she was too calm, too small, almost silent. In the first few days, the doctors said it was normal, that each baby followed a rhythm. But over time, Izzy began to notice something wasn't right. The little girl slept more than expected, didn't seem to react to stimuli like her brother. At first, Izzy thought it was in her head. After all, she was a first-time mother, exhausted, her nerves frayed. But one early morning, noticing Olivia's breathing was shallow and her lips bluish, she rushed to the hospital. Alexander arrived 15 minutes later, his shirt still unbuttoned and his eyes wide with panic. "What happened?" Izzy just pointed to the incubator where the baby was already being monitored. "They don't know yet. They're investigating." But she was cold, Alexander. So cold. Tests revealed an initial diagnosis of pulmonary dysplasia, a common condition in premature babies, but one that would require intensive monitoring. The doctor explained with clinical gentleness that Olivia would need oxygen therapy indefinitely and constant pediatric follow-up. Izzy listened as if the words were bubbles floating in. The air, Fragile, distant, too dangerous to touch. Alexander held her hand, but she didn't reciprocate. Her eyes were fixed on the glass separating parents from the neonatal ICU. "I did everything right. I took care of everything," she murmured, as if trying to retrace her steps to an invisible error. "You did nothing wrong," Alexander said softly. "This isn't your fault." But she didn't hear. She only saw her daughter, tiny, with a tube in her nose and sensors all over her little body. She doesn't even know she's alive. And I don't even know if I'm ready for this. The following days were the longest of their lives. Izzy didn't leave the hospital. She slept in a makeshift armchair, her hair haphazardly tied up, dark circles like valleys beneath her eyes. Alexander, for his part, suspended meetings, cancelled engagements, and transferred control of his company to his partner indefinitely. "You'll ruin your reputation," one of the board members warned. "My daughter is breathing. Through tubes." "My reputation can wait," Alexander replied without hesitation. They began to live among monitors, feeding schedules and medical reports. But it was there, in that cold, silent room, that Alexander saw something he would never forget. Izzy, her voice choked, singing softly to Olivia, "Estrelita, ¿dónde estás?" The Spanish lullaby echoed among the machines, and the little girl, for the first time, moved her fingers. Alexander wept. He wept as he never had before, for love, for fear, for gratitude. But the days passed, and Olivia didn't improve. There were nights when her saturation dropped sharply, alarms blared, and Izzy ran through the hospital corridors, her heart in her throat. The nurses already knew her by name, knew when to avoid words and when to just offer a glass of water. Alexander tried to stay calm, but there were moments when he would leave the ICU and punch the steering wheel of his car in the parking lot. One early morning, he found Izzy sitting on the floor of the waiting room, her eyes lost, her body hunched as if everything in her was breaking. He knelt beside her, hugged her without saying anything, and they cried together, not from weakness, but from love. A love that bled because it couldn't do more. "What if she doesn't come home, Alexander?" Izzy whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if she never even knows we existed for her?" He pressed his forehead against hers. "Then she'll feel it. Even if she doesn't remember, she'll feel it. Because we love her as if the world depended on it." Hope became a seed. It didn't guarantee a flower, but it was all they had. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to carry the weight of his sister's silence in his small body. He grew strong but quiet. He cried little, ate well, slept without fuss, and this, instead of consoling, worried Izzy even more. "He feels her absence," she murmured one night, rocking her son in her arms, sitting beside Olivia's empty crib. They shared the same womb. He knows someone is missing. Alexander began alternating nights at the hospital with nights at home, trying to maintain a minimal routine for the boy. But it was impossible to ignore the emptiness that stretched between them. There was one night when Daniel woke up crying inconsolably, something that never happened, and Izzy burst into tears in the middle of the living room. "I'm not managing to be a mother to either of them," she confessed, trembling, unable to pick up her son. Alexander took Daniel in his arms, rocked him, and looked at her with firmness and gentleness. "You are being everything they need, even when you don't believe it." Time seemed suspended in an endless wait. Each passing day was a new chapter of tests, uncertainties, and attempts to control the uncontrollable. Izzy read scientific articles late at night, sought out specialists, asked everything, but deep down, what she feared most was losing faith. "What if medicine isn't enough?" she whispered to the doctor one afternoon, her eyes red. The doctor held her hands with a compassion that didn't come from books. "Then she will fight with the strength that comes from you. That's what babies do. They fight, even when they're small." Alexander, watching Izzy slowly crumble, began writing letters to Olivia. Letters he left in an envelope inside the incubator. "My little warrior," one began. "Today Daddy saw the sunrise, and it seemed to be calling you. but you still need to sleep a little longer. When you wake up, we'll see that sun together." Izzy found him writing one of them one night. She said nothing, just sat beside him and held his hand. There were no more walls, only the fragile hope of two devastated hearts trying to survive. The following weeks were a succession of ups and downs. Olivia would improve one day and regress the next. Each gain was a millimeter victory, breathing without support for 10 minutes, reacting to sounds, closing her eyes at the touch of light. Izzy and Alexander came to know the names of all the nurses, the rhythm of the machines, the metallic smell of the corridors. But there were also small miracles. One day, while Izzy was singing softly to her, Olivia moved her hand and grasped her mother's finger with unexpected strength. Izzy stopped singing, her eyes wide, and began to cry as if opening the floodgates of a river. Alexander, beside her, recorded it all with his phone, and in the video, his emotional whisper could be heard. "She heard you. She chose you." This gesture, the smallest of all, was what initiated the slow turnaround. It wasn't a cure yet, but it was a first yes from life, a timid nod that the worst might be passing. It was in this fragile and real context that Izzy's strength blossomed even more overwhelmingly. She was no longer the woman fighting for a place among the giants of the economy. She was now a mother rising above the pain, holding her daughter's hand while reading contracts, still finding time to look into Alexander's eyes and say, "Don't let me harden. I don't want to lose the sweet part that still remains in me." And he, his voice choked, would reply, "You are still the woman who made me rethink my entire life in a hotel in the Rockies. But now, you are also the woman teaching our daughter to breathe." And this Izzy, more human, more vulnerable, more whole, was the strongest of all. One night, towards the end of the 7th week of hospitalization, the doctor came in smiling. "You can hold her in your arms." For the first time, the two looked at each other as if they no longer knew what to do with good news. Alexander gave Izzy the space, and when she took Olivia in her arms, she felt that the world finally was starting to turn again. The day Olivia was discharged was met with a kind of joy that couldn't be put into words. It was a timid spring morning, with a clear sky and a fresh breeze, as if even nature knew that this little warrior had won an impossible battle. Izzy dressed her daughter in a beige wool onesie and wrapped her in a blanket embroidered with stars, a gift from an emotional nurse. Alexander took photos like a doting father, trying to immortalize every detail. The first yawn outside the ICU, the first more alert gaze, the first cry in an open environment. Daniel, still small, seemed to notice that the family was, at last, complete. He looked at his sister with a mixture of curiosity and relief. When they all gathered at the hospital exit, the doctor bid them farewell. With an emotional smile, "You weren't just patients, you were a love story in the making, and stories like these teach even those who think they've seen it all." Back at the apartment, everything felt new. The sound of 2 breaths, the weight of 2 cribs side by side, the smell of milk, of a recent bath, of living skin. Izzy spent the first night awake, not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. Sitting on the nursery floor between her 2 sleeping children, she looked at Alexander, who was asleep on the sofa in a milk-stained shirt, one of the little ones in his arms. She smiled. It wasn't the scenario she had imagined for her perfect life. It was better. It was real, with its flaws, messes, and a love that had withstood time, fear, and the unknown. The next morning, as they had coffee on the balcony with the babies in their laps, Alexander handed her an invitation in a gold envelope. "It's time to rewrite that place, remember?" Izzy opened the paper with trembling hands. It was the reservation for the resort in the Rockies. The same resort, the same type of room. "We're getting married where it all began, but this time we'll arrive together." The plan was simple and symbolic. Few guests, their children in their arms, an altar overlooking the mountains. Izzy hesitated at first. There were traces of pain within those glass walls, memories of the shared room, the hostile stares, the woman who once felt she needed to flee. But when she arrived at the hotel months later, in a light dress and her eyes firm, she felt that time had done its work. Nothing hurt anymore. On the contrary, every corner now held new layers. Upon entering the lobby, she saw the same receptionist, who smiled upon recognizing her. "This time, Ms. Rossi, the room is all yours." Izzy laughed, took the key, and replied, "It's ours." And as she turned, she found Alexander with Daniel in his arms and Olivia sleeping in a sling against his chest. His eyes shone with the quiet certainty of those who want nothing more than to continue belonging. The ceremony took place in the late afternoon, with the sun melting into the mountains like liquid gold. Izzy walked to the altar on her older brother's arm, while the guests were moved. Alexander, in a light grey suit and misty eyes, held the children beside a nanny. When Izzy reached him, Olivia stretched out her little hand as if wanting to touch her. The ceremony was brief, intimate, made of whispered vows and long gazes. "You arrived like an error in my reservation, and stayed as the right in my soul," Alexander said, placing the ring. Izzy replied, her voice choked, "I thought I needed to conquer the world, but all I needed was a home, and that home is you." When they kissed, the chapel bells rang, the children laughed in their godparents' arms, and the cold mountain breeze brought a certainty. Nothing was easy. But everything, absolutely everything, was worth it. Life in New York found its own rhythm, like an improvised song that gradually finds its melody. Their apartment on the Upper West Side was simple, welcoming, filled with details built together. Photos of the twins magnet on the fridge, toys scattered on the wooden floor, finance books mixed with children's books on the shelf. Izzy now worked part-time as a social impact consultant, balancing Zoom meetings with bottles and children's laughter. Alexander, in turn, transformed his own routine. He declined invitations to evening corporate events and turned off his phone during dinner. "My biggest investment now has a name, smells like baby powder, and has 2 pairs of attentive eyes," he'd joke. And on nights when everything seemed to fall apart, because parenthood was still made of chaos, they would look at each other and know they were together, and that was enough. One autumn afternoon, they went for a walk in Central Park. The red and orange leaves formed a carpet underfoot. Olivia, now recovered and smiling, walked hand in hand with Alexander, while Daniel ran ahead, pointing at every squirrel as if it were a newly discovered treasure. Izzy watched everything with a rare peace, camera in hand, capturing the small miracles of daily life. They stopped near a lake. The reflection of the family in the water made her smile. "If someone had told me that day in the Rockies that all this was waiting for me, I would have called them crazy." Alexander hugged her from behind, his arms around her waist. "That night, I just wanted silence. I just wanted a room to myself." She laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you ended up with a whole life." He kissed her temple and whispered, "The best mistake I ever made." Later, sitting on a wooden bench with the children asleep in their strollers, they talked about the future. "Do you think we're ready for a house with a yard?" Alexander asked. "I think we're ready for anything, as long as it's together," Izzy replied. The sun was setting behind the buildings, gilding their faces, warming even the parts that the harshest winter had tried to freeze. Nothing was perfect. There were still doubts, sleepless nights, diapers, and accumulated emails. But what they had built was strong, not because it had been easy, but because it had endured, because it had been chosen, cultivated, and renewed every day. Because true love isn't born from the absence of problems. It's born from the decision to remain, even when everything invites escape. And then, as the narrator finally observes, from a distance, that family crossing the park bridge with slow steps and light smiles, the last reflection draws itself like a finish line. Among the mountains where it all began, they understood that a true home isn't a place. it's someone, and that sometimes destiny arrives disguised as a mistake, just to give us what the heart didn't yet know how to ask for.